Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about the box model in CSS. So what exactly is the box model? Well, for starters, do you remember how we fired up the dev tools earlier in the course and we saw that every element is contained inside a box, and that box consists of the content of the element, but then surrounding that we have padding. The padding is outside the content, but it's inside the border. We then have the border, and outside the border, we have the margin. And we're able to control every aspect of this box. We can create larger padding, larger margins. We can have a border, we can style the border. We can do whatever we want with this box. Now, this is a great starting point, but we need to know that there are different types of boxes in CSS. We have block boxes or block elements, and we have inline elements. We then also have a hybrid, which is a cross between the two, referred to as inline block elements. So when we have a block element, the way it behaves is that it always takes up an entire line, and we can style it using width and height properties. Inline is different. It doesn't have all of the characteristics of a block element. An inline element only takes up the required horizontal space. So if that element is a span and it simply has one word in, well, it's only going to take up the width of that one word. It's not going to take up the entire line. And if we then include another inline element next to that inline element, it's going to appear on the same line. In fact, inline elements will always appear next to each other until the space on that line runs out, and only at that point will an inline element now appear on the next line. So it exhausts all of the horizontal space before taking up a new line. The difference with inline elements is that we can't style them with width and height. We can style their margins and padding, so they still have some of the characteristics of a block element, but they won't respond to width and height. So if you've ever tried to style a span with a width value, you'll notice that it doesn't appear to work, or if you've tried to give a span a height, it doesn't work. Inline block is a cross between the two. So for the most part, it's the same as inline. So if we have an inline block element, it's going to try and appear on the same line as a previous element, provided that previous element is not a block, because if it is, it's going to be taking up the entire line. But assuming we have an inline element, and we place an inline block element next to it, it's going to try and appear on the same line. The difference between inline block and inline is that we can style the width and height of an inline block element. So you can see the details on the screen right now. Inline block is like a hybrid. It's basically inline, but the key difference is we can style the width and the height. So we'll see examples of how all of this works shortly. But before we do that, let's discuss inner display types. So what we've been discussing with block, and inline are outer display types, whereas inside that box itself, we can also have a display type. And two very common examples are flex and grid. It allows us to lay out the elements inside a box according to a certain paradigm. Now, we're not going to talk about how flex and grid works in CSS just yet. We'll discuss that later in the course. We just need to know that a box has both an outer display and an inner display. So if we give an element the property display with the value flex, what that does is set the outer display to a block type element, but the inner display to flex. And if we set display grid, it sets the outer to block and the inner to grid. If we set the display to inline-flex, well, you might be able to guess what this does. It sets the outer display type of the element to inline, but it sets the inner display type of the element to flex. And similarly, if we set display inline grid, it sets the outer display of an element to inline, but the inner display type to grid. If this seems abstract at this stage, don't worry too much. This example should help to make things clear. On this page, we have 3 spans and 3 divs, and they're labeled span 1, span 2, span 3, and div 1, div 2, and div 3. And we've given some basic styling. We've set the background color of the span to cyan, and we've set the background color of the div to red. There's no difference in the HTML, we just have 3 spans and 3 divs, but when we look at the actual page, we can see that they're being rendered differently. And the reason for that is that span is an inline element by default, and div is a block element by default. So notice with our span 1 doesn't take up very much space. So when we add span 2, there's enough space for span 2 to appear on the same line as span 1, since they're both inline elements. And the same for span 3. We would have to keep adding lots of extra spans before they finally reach the end of the line. Let's see if we can do that. So you can see at this point, once the end of the line is reached, now these inline elements will go to the new line, but only when that point is reached. Otherwise, they will default to appearing on the same line as each other. Now, the code for the div is almost identical to the code for the span, but the key difference here is that a div is a block element by default. So notice that the text div1 doesn't really take up very much space, but even so, the element itself takes up the entire width of the viewport. Remember, we said that block elements always take up the entire horizontal width by default. Now, to illustrate some of the concepts we discussed, let's try and set a width on the span. Let's set the width of the span to 200 pixels. Let's see what happens. Nothing happens. It's an inline element. We can try as much as we want to set the width and the height, but nothing's going to change this inline element. We can't configure the width and the height on an inline element. However, what we can do is we can control the padding. So let's just say we really wanted some space between those spans. We can't control the width directly, but we could control the margin. So as an example, we could set margin left 100 pixels. Let's see what happens. You can see that span gets spread out because each of those spans now has a 100 pixel margin to the left. So we do have, in some senses, control over the width, but it's indirectly by configuring the margin. And in a similar way, we can also control the padding of the span. So if we set padding to 10 pixels, notice now that the element looks visually taller. If we were to set padding bottom 100 pixels, well, in some senses, it appears that we actually have control over the element's height. Although notice how that span is now bleeding into the div. And that's because we're not actually changing the height property of these spans. The interesting thing, if you play around in the dev tools, you'll see that actually the height of those spans remains unchanged, but now the padding is actually overflowing the height of the element. Because if we legitimately made these spans taller, then those divs in red would also move down to accommodate the increased height of the span. So although it looks like we have some very rudimentary control over the height of the span, we're actually just controlling the padding, not the height of the span itself. However, we can change the display type of any element with the display property. So as a simple example, if I set this to display block, it's going to start behaving exactly like the div. So now there's not really any difference between the span and the div. So a div is basically a span with a display of block. Same kind of thing with the div, but in reverse. If I were to set the div to display inline, it's now going to behave like the span was originally. So another way of thinking about this is a span is simply a div with a display of inline. But we know there's also a hybrid intermediary form of these different boxes. So if we set the display on the span to inline block, well, firstly, it's going to behave initially as an inline element. Notice as well, because those divs are also inline elements, now everything's appearing in a row. So let's set the div back to their default display. The key difference is that now we can have control over the width of the span. So we could set span width 100 pixels. Ironically, that was actually narrower than they were originally. So let's set the width to 350 pixels. And in fact, they're wide enough now where they can't all fit on the same line. Let's see if we can get a value where they're wider, but they do all fit on the same line. 250. And of course, if we wanted to, we could still have a bit of a margin between them. And of course, another thing that we might be interested in if we were actually laying this out on a real page is to set the text align to center. You can now see that the text appears in the center of those inline block spans. Now, one final point regarding those divs, we can actually change the width. For example, if we set the width to 200 pixels, we can see those divs now only take up 200 pixel space. So there is technically room for div 2 to appear side by side div 1. But you can see that these block elements, we could think of them as being greedy. Even if they only need 200 pixels, they still take up the entire width of the viewport. So that div 2 is not allowed to appear next to div 1 because they both want to take up the full width. Even though we know now that all of these divs are only 200 pixels, they're still reserving the rest of that horizontal space. All you would have to do is change them to display inline block. Now they're going to start behaving like the spans. They will appear next to each other if there's space, but we can still define the width of those elements. So the key takeaways here, the differences between block, inline, and inline block elements, and also that spans in HTML are inline by default, whereas divs are block by default, but we can just change the display property. So we could set the display property on a span so it starts behaving like a div, and vice versa. We also know that it's possible to set the inner display type of these elements using properties and values such as display flex and display grid, but we're going to talk about those a bit later on in the course. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the course.